So our talk today is, I mean, it's almost limitless in terms of what we could focus on. Does prayer really work? And I thought that since the issue has been raised by several of you in the course of our conversations during this past month, that I would focus on how prayer works in particular when it comes to one of the, I think, most pernicious parasites of spiritual life, or life in general, psychological and emotional at the same time, which is guilt. So I'm going to focus on what is the particular way in which prayer works with regard to guilt. And for this, I'm going to focus, you're going to allow me, on a passage from the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verses 2 to 11, which you find on the last page of your handout. So it is the passage which is called of the adulterous woman, which I think should be called of the humiliated woman, not the adulterous woman. So at dawn, Jesus appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, famous sentence, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with a woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and live your life." Now, there is a sentence which in the book of Psalms, which I have has become very central to my life of prayer over the years, strangely, because it is a sentence which is, I think, one of the most problematic in the book of Psalms, and probably in the whole scripture, which you have at the beginning of your handout. There should be, number one. Yes, about number one. And the sentence is, "It is good for me to be afflicted so that I might learn your decrees." It is good for me to be afflicted. Sometimes in some translation, it is good for me to be humiliated so that I might learn your lesson. Okay? Now, when I say that this sentence is extremely problematic, it's because it implies that God positively causes or allows us to suffer to give us a lesson. Now, I won't ask you to tell me now in the presence of everyone, but I want you to ask yourself whether you have ever thought this thing, that, this particular suffering, this particular misfortune that's happened to my life, this particular painful thing, in one way or the other, it must have been something which has come to me because I've done something wrong, or I've not done everything right. Or even worse, it is the Lord who is sending to me this particular painful thing, this particular illness, this particular, the list can be very long, because I need to learn a lesson. It is good for me to be afflicted to be humiliated, to be punished, so that I may learn your decrees. Now, this sentence is problematic, again, because it implies that God positively causes or allows us to suffer to give up a lesson. In other sentences in Scripture seem to vouch for this interpretation, like the words from the book of Proverbs, quoted in the letter to the Hebrews: "The Lord disciplines those he loves and punishes everyone he accepts as son with it." This punishing God. This God who, to teach us a lesson, punishes us. However, and here we reach the topic of today, more persuasive even than the apparent confirmation from Scripture, this interpretation is welcomed by the most insidious parasite of our spiritual and emotional life, namely guilt. If this misfortune, this trouble, this accident is happening to me, is because I have disobeyed God, I've displeased him, or even if I don't believe in God, is because I've done something wrong. In any case, I deserve it. This is a travesty of Christian faith. Let me tell you straight away. I've had this conversation so many times, and I found people, religious people, extremely religious people, who think that guilt is good for spiritual life because it pushes me to do something, to act well. I totally disagree. For me, guilt is the most insidious, the most pernicious enemy of spiritual life, not to talk of psychological, of our psychology and of our emotional and psychological well-being. And it comes from a pagan sense of sacred that has plagued mankind ever since the first religious feelings dawned in the conscience of our earliest ancestors. And it is that from which Jesus has come to liberate us. Instinctive human piety is based on fear, on terror. Instinctive religion, the religion which comes to every human being when his conscience dawns to the universe, is based on fear. And why it is based on fear? This is an elementary principle of evolutionary psychology, is that confronted with an environment that they could only partially understand, our forebears ascribed everything they could not explain to invisible agents: God, demons, spirits, goblins, fairies, witches, name it, whose identity and motives were unfound. Imagine that you think that you are the prey of invisible beings you cannot see and you don't know what their intention. Are there good intentions? Are there bad intentions? How can I prevent them from doing bad things to me? Nothing is more tempting than attributing calamities or misfortunes to supernatural agents that we might have inadvertently displeased and that have to be appeased in one way or the other. Now, anthropological studies about the origin of blood sacrifice, done especially in African tribes or tribes in Latin America, etc., have more or less established that blood has always been perceived as a way of expiating the possible displeasure of whichever of these supernatural agents we might have offended. So how do you get in touch with the invisible world? How do you give a token of your goodwill? How do you pay an invisible being? So one of the ways, it's not the only one by any special imagination, but one of the ways in which instinctively people think that I can pay an invisible being, or I can ingratiate an invisible being, is offering blood. So blood sacrifice. Okay? We might think that we have overcome these primitive instincts today, especially as we are more or less persuaded that everything that can be explained scientifically, and that if something still seems incomprehensible, we will get there one day. And yet, these instincts remain very much alive and have changed that focus only marginally. We are exactly like them. We have changed a little bit in terms of the way we live, but in terms of fears, in terms of the way we relate to the world, and in terms of the jungle, it's not the jungle in the forest, it's the jungle of city, but we still live in a jungle, we still behave as we live in a jungle. Whether or not we believe that there is an explanation for a tsunami, for a tornado yesterday, I mean, the day before yesterday, 22 people died. Have you seen the pictures of devastation there? An earthquake or a terror attack, or more mundanely, an illness, flood, and anxiety, heartbreak, and so on. Whenever any of these adversity hits us, we cannot evade a nagging question from bothering us. Why me? What have I done to deserve it? We might not acknowledge it, but this sentence, the sentence I quoted you at the beginning, it is good for me to be afflicted that I might learn your decrees, betrays that core belief in the existence of some agent or principle at work in nature and history, which inflicts retaliation or corrective misery on us. Belief in the God of Jesus Christ does not automatically shield us from these instincts, and this can condition our interpretation of this event. Now, the first question we have to ask ourselves, and I believe me, I've asked questions myself many times. How is it possible that a sentence of this kind become a prayer? And the question comes from the fact that when we find it in the book of Psalms, and the book of Psalms is the model for prayer, is the summa of the prayer of Israel, is that which is being used and is being used to pray, all over the world, has been used for thousands of years. The answer is that it benefits us precisely insofar as it gave voice to our guilt. It unmasked our guilt and possibly entrusts it to the Lord. In many ways, this is similar, allow me the image, to what happens when a child who has done some mischief cries in the anticipation of reproach and punishment, knowing that the mother or the father will react in exactly the opposite way, with consoling words and acts. The only remedy for guilt is tenderness. The moment we entrust guilt to the Father's love, it loses its power and vanishes like fog when the sun rises. This is Jesus' way of dealing with us too, not by threatening to punish us, but through gentleness, patience, and mercy, as we see especially in the episode of the woman caught in adultery, which I read to you at the beginning. For those who have arrived later, it is in the last page of the handout. In this distressing and violent episode, Jesus defies the entrenched misogyny and the patriarchal structure of social, political, and religious order, just as he did in his encounter with the Samaritan woman. The woman here is totally passive, treated as a lifeless object. She doesn't say a word until the end when Jesus asks her a question. Otherwise, she doesn't say anything. Until Jesus talks to her, she has no voice. Even before being stoned, and here is the important point, she's already crushed under the implacable weight of the social conventions that have molded her identity since her childhood and make her feel as she deserves to be an object of scorn, exposed to public ignominy and condemned to death. She is in the hands of a group of men authorized by religion, law, and social conventions to treat her in this way. Nobody can stop that. Nobody can. They have the law on their side, possess the unassailable power of self-righteousness, act as the rightful and the indispensable forces of the social order. The violence of this scene is incredible. This is one of the most violent scenes in the gospel. When you start realizing all the levels under the surface. How must this woman have? There is no consideration for her shock and utter devastation. No attempt to investigate the possible motives behind her action. Had she betrayed her husband out of sheer lust? Or was this the tragic outcome of a deep unhappiness and frustration of an arranged marriage? I think the marriages were arranged at that time. Had she fallen in love with someone who had shown sympathy for her suffering, being kind to her? Was what had happened just a momentary weakness? For these accusers, motives were irrelevant. An adultery involves two characters, but the teachers of the law and the Pharisees bring only the woman. This is also interesting. Men's casual sexual encounters were a serious breach of the law, but relatively harmless after all. Women, on the other hand, could not be allowed to wriggle out of the absolute dependence in which marriage locked them. The fabric of society depended on them. Thus, the woman herself must have had feelings not dissimilar to what, and this is why I chose this story to illustrate the point I'm trying to make. She must have said to herself, as she was about to be stoned, as she was being brought in the presence of all these men, it is good for me to be afflicted, it is good for me to be humiliated, it is good for me to be punished. Probably still half naked, at the mercy of unforgiving eyes, she already knows that nobody will ever stand up for her, that she is lost, utterly isolated. Even if she is still physically alive, she has lost her place in society. She has lost her connection to her family. She has lost her dignity. She is dishonored. Nobody will treat her with respect ever again. And whoever, if there even was someone who showed sympathy for her, this person would be contaminated by her sin practice. This is the level of curse, how deep it can go. Physical death was only going to sanction the social death. This woman was already dead. She was already dead. Even she was alive, she was already dead, social death. And in those societies, social death means death. All social groups are aware of the fatal sway of this form of punishment. More even than death, imprisonment, or torture, nothing crushes a person like the segregation resulting from excommunication, that is, from being expelled from communication with a group. Now, paradoxically, segregation is a form of violence we are just as able to inflict on ourselves. And here's the point I wanted to make. By giving way to guilt, by judging and condemning ourselves. Our ultimate and harshest judge is our own ego. Whether with reference to convention, values, standards, or ideal achievement, it doesn't have to be religion. Conventions, values, standards, ideal achievements, expectations from your parents, I mean, name it. And the list is very long. We think that we can remedy what we perceive to be our waywardness, mediocrity, laziness, or compensate for them through a relentless inner nagging. It is good for me to be afflicted. It is good for me to be humiliated. It is good for me to be punished. Just like the whole drama staged by the Pharisees against Jesus, this inner nagging is a trap. They were using this question as a trap, said John, the Gospel, the author of John's Gospel, in order to have a basis for accusing him. Through accusation, exclusion, and condemnation, the group funneled and expelled its inner violence on an external target, and in this way preserves and increases its inner cohesion. This is the theory of the scapegoat by René Girard, which I think really captures something essential about the way in which these mechanisms work in society. Self-accusation plays an analogous role. Our heart frames the events of our life in ways that highlight failure, highlight inadequacy, highlight unworthiness. Our best motives become the basis for self-reproach. It is good for me to be afflicted. And what makes guilt so insidious is that it seems to be something that wants us to be better. But in reality, the only thing is down. This applies in a special way to religion, of course. Even when we claim to be indifferent to its institutionalized forms, do not attend church or ignore the teachers of the law, we can never altogether shake the bits of teaching we have internalized at a vulnerable stage in our life and that rear their heads in times of vulnerability. And this plagues society, especially the people who are not believers who go to church. Why? Because at least if people go to church, even if you have received a kind of contaminated version of Christianity, they are given the possibility of correcting it through, hopefully, good preaching, good teaching, going to church. But the people who only have internalized that kind of elementary and corrupted form of Christianity when they were children, that's the only reference they have. And the only one which is going to come back to her at the junctures of their lives. We might not use the same words, but we have the corresponding feelings. It is good for me to be afflicted, to be punished, that I might learn your decrees. One of the most disturbing sentences I've ever heard in this connection was related to me by a dear, dear friend of mine, who was brought up in a conservative Christian house, 10 children, 11 children, Dutch, from Dutch Calvinist background. He came out to his family, he came out as gay, to his family when he was a teenager, and has now lived in a loving relationship with his partner for several years. Both of them are very good friends. I see this gay couple as a model for many reasons: their faith, their mutual commitment, the imagination they put in their relationship, their generous hospitality. They bought a big house because they want to have people staying with them all the time. They want the house to be open to all the guests. Eventually, the family of one of the two, was touched by the seriousness of my friend's commitment, because at the beginning, of course, they said, it's sinful, the usual thing, and became progressively more accepted. On the surface, therefore, there was recognition, but unease was not dispelled altogether, and despite their willingness to be affirming, at one point, almost inadvertently, the brother of this friend of mine came out with his chilling sentence: deep down, you know that this is sin. Deep down, you know that this is sin. Deep down, if you really listen to your heart, you will find a voice accusing you and condemning your lifetime. The assumption is that this inner accusation and condemnation is God's way of leading us. What can anyone retort to such a manipulative admonition? I can be distressed, outraged, and rejected, but I cannot avoid its poisonous effect. Instinctive piety thrives in these feelings. Inner affliction is the only way to learn moral lessons. That's the principle. Guilt underpins a spiritual edifice, just as the public shaming and stoning of a woman caught in adultery upholds religious order in society. Condemnation is a rallying cry which nobody dares challenge. The violence and abuse are not only not primarily physical, but are emotional and psychological. Had the woman escaped the stoning, I told you earlier, she would have felt condemned anyway, and her worst enemy was going to be herself. Her own heart would have condemned her life, even if she escaped. And you see, Jesus needed to liberate her, not just from the people who want to stone her from outside, but from the self-stoning he would keep inflicting towards her for the rest of her life. Now, you have really sometimes to have a bit of cinematic imagination when you deal with the gospel, and try really to see, like, with a camera, put a camera on that. Because I think that Jesus' reaction in this gospel visually is absolutely stunning. Imagine all these people shouting around. This woman standing, humiliated, crying, probably already bleeding. He keeps silent and bends down towards the ground. He diverts the agitation laboriously built up by the mob and dissipates its energy. A murderous gang cannot tolerate any distraction from its blind determination to dispose of the catalyst of its hatred. Violence, surprise, or wonder could instantaneously deflate power. And the leaders of the mob are immediately aware of its danger and try to keep the fire of indignation burning by pushing Jesus for a reaction. It is a great moment. Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. Now, as you know, this gesture is a reference to God writing the tables of the law for Moses with his finger. He said the finger of God wrote the tables of the law. So the idea is the same God who wrote that law, or was supposed to have written that law, on the basis of which the woman was being stoned, is now rewriting that. So that's probably one of the symbolism about the finger writing, Jesus' finger writing on the sand. The dynamics of accusation, both under the collective form described by the gospel or under the guise of the inner nagging of guilt, tighten that grip on us by monopolizing a shared perception of reality or individual independence. The idea is that there is no way out. A complicity with the mob is unavoidable if you want to survive. If you belong to those societies, there's no way out. And in the case of guilt, no credible alternative narrative rescues us from the clutch of the voice that taunts us. Deep down, you know that you are wrong, that you deserve it, that you have to be punished. By catching our attention, by diverting us from our obsession, by puzzling us, Jesus breaks the conspiracy, undermines the mob, empowers the actors of the drama to take responsibility for themselves. Most people are dragged into a mob out of curiosity or reluctantly, or simply because resistance would be interpreted as opposition to the group and eventually prove risky. Jesus breaks this vicious spiral with one literally disarming, as you know, I mean, this sentence is so famous. For one reason, there must be a reason. Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone. Jesus unmasks the illusion that evil can be expelled by casting it on a transgressor. The adultery has been committed by the woman and obviously an unnamed man, but everyone else has been complicit in creating the social, religious, and cultural conditions that contributed to it, the adultery. The patriarchal structure that denied women a right to choose when it comes to marriage, the total disregard for the history of this particular woman, her lifestyle, her aspiration, and the possible mitigating circumstances of her act. Jesus' sentence, who among you is without sin cast the first stone, is not an invitation to give in to evil, but one to fight evil, not through judgment and accusation, but through humble self-knowledge. The only way to truly change the world is by changing our own heart first. It is not an encouragement to replace, it is not an encouragement to replace accusation and condemnation of others with self-blame and guilt either, because that's the problem. The problem is that the sentence might be interpreted as let anyone who is without sin cast the first stone as an invitation to guilt. On the contrary, Jesus has come to put an end to both. I told you that the instinctive religiosity is naturally based on fear. And I said to you, what Jesus has come to get rid of is precisely fear. This is why he says there is no fear in love in the first letter of St. John, which for John, for the author of this letter, can be paraphrased as fear disappears the moment we welcome God's love, God's tenderness. This is why I told you that the only remedy for guilt, for us thinking that we deserve to be punished, etc., is God's love. God makes clear that, also John makes clear that of this when he said, we love because he, God, first loved us. The only who fears is not made perfect. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. That is, as long as we let guilt and fear of punishment drive our thoughts and influence our decision, we are still resisting the freedom God wants to give us. When Paul says it is for freedom that God has made you free, the essential freedom is first of all from this form of pagan sense of religiosity based on fear. And this appears luminously in the epilogue of the story of this woman, which I think is incredible. And I told you, it should be called not the adulterous woman, but the humiliated woman. We are offered one of the most moving dialogues in the whole of Scripture. Jesus was left, the woman is still standing there. Everyone is gone. Again, think about the vision. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" No one's. First time she took it. First word of this woman knows. Then neither do I condemn you. Jesus declared, "Go now and live your life of sin." Jesus does not condemn her because authentic change, and this is the key point, authentic change, conversion, renewal, and the overcoming of evil never happens through coercion. Least of all through the bullying of fear. Judgment and condemnation lead us nowhere and do not help anyone. Jesus says, "I did not come to judge the world, to save the world." If God does not judge us, why should we judge each other and judge ourselves? He has come precisely to give us this good news. Neither do I judge you. And God does not judge us because he knows that judgment does not change anyone. God does not condemn us because he knows that condemnation does not change anyone. God does not bully us, does not force us, because he knows that by that way, nobody is going really to change. We might alter our behavior externally for a while, but we are not going to change the heart. And everything we have seen about the essence of Christianity, especially through the analysis of the Sermon on the Mount, is that Christianity is about the change of the heart. If there is no change of the heart, simple changing behavior won't do, doesn't. He can enjoin to us, as he does to the woman, to go and fight against evil in our life and in the world, because he has freed us from sin, evil, judgment, condemnation, and guilt. He has taught us to rely only on his mercy to become the agent of his consolation. Our only chance to overcome evil, both around us and in us, depends on us listening not to the inner bullying of our heart, but to Jesus repeating to us, "Neither do I condemn you." In just the same way, John beautifully declared in his first letter, this sentence is, someone described it as the Himalaya of the New Testament, or the K2, if you think the K2 is higher. This is how we set our hearts at rest in his presence. If our heart condemns us, we know that God is greater than our heart and he knows everything. If and when our heart condemns us, we have to think that God is greater than our heart and he knows everything. And yet, he does not condemn us. God is not naive. He knows everything. If he didn't know, then we would think, oh, wow, easy for him to forgive or not to judge us. But he knows everything. He knows ourselves better than we know ourselves. He knows our sinfulness, ambiguity, flaws, irresolution, indolence, loss better than we do ourselves. Guilt obsesses with one or other of the negative aspects of our personality, not because it knows us as God does, but on the contrary, because it is incapable of seeing the whole picture. Guilt is a lack of perspective on our vision. Guilt, in the end, I believe, is a form of narcissism that bemoans the negative aspects of our personality only because they do not correspond to the image we want to have of ourselves. When we give over to guilt, we despise ourselves and our heart shrink. And we overcome guilt only when, instead of looking into a mirror, we measure our real value by the way the Father looks at us, loves us, forgives us, affirms and reassures us. What God says to us is, neither do I condemn you. I am greater than you. Now, if I insist so much on this point, it's because I know for experience that fight against guilt is one of the most difficult things, precisely because guilt is like the devil presents itself to us as an angel of light. And again, I've had so many times conversations, especially with people who are religious, who think that guilt is a spur we need to act better. But think about the way you would educate your children. Would you ever want your child to do things out of being bullied, out of being judged, feeling judged? And unfortunately, sometimes it happens in our education. And the consequences are not pretty in the way we build a personality. But the problem is that, it's the way in which we do it with us. And when it comes to the effectiveness of prayer, and again, I said to you, we can consider it for many aspects, but I am concerned, for me, the essential job of prayer for years and years and years and years has been to reassure me on that one is not loved, I'm not loved for what I do, or because of what I don't do, but I'm loved because God is Father and loves us as we are. And then the other thing of which prayer reassures me is that God does want me to become better. Of course he does. But the way he does it is never through coercion. It's never through bullying. It's never through force or threatening. It is through loving. And this is something which, however many times you can hear, like, this talk today, doesn't come in. I mean, there is something in our psychology which is resistant. It is only by the conversion which is operated through, this humble way of going back to God in prayer and letting God reassure us that he is our Father, that he loves us, that little by little, like a knot, his guilt is undone, is dissolved. And it's a process that can take a long time. And it's never done once for all. This is why, paradoxically, and I'm going to end on this, to me, this sentence, it is it's good for me to be humiliated so that I might learn your decree, and become a prayer in times whenever something went wrong for me, that was the feeling out. And by saying this prayer, it was unmasked, this feeling, and somehow I could offer it to the Lord, and then get the reassurance that, of course it is not true. Of course it is not that. When it comes to misfortune, tragedies like the tornado of last night, or tonight, so when it comes to earthquakes, when it comes to death, when it comes to all the things that really plague our life, nobody wants. They are not caused by any evil agent who wants evil. They just happen. And they happen because the world is what it is, because creation is what it is, because we don't know why. They happen. So we should never think that when something bad happens, it is because we have observed it one way or the other, or because there is an order that distributes events. So the tornado has gone to these people because they needed to be punished, or because there was someone there that needed to be punished. So well, let's bring a tornado. Of course, it doesn't make any sense. And the only thing that Christianity does, that Jesus does, and especially this time of Passion, this is the thing, the key message that comes from the cross. What Jesus does is that it not only is not the one who sends us these things to teach us a lesson, but it's the one who, when these things happen, because they happen, will take them on himself with us. Yes, this is what God does. What God does is he suffers with us. He takes the suffering on himself with us. Yes, this is what he does. But he never sends it